Here's a classic view, Hong Kong Island, taken from the harbour. Let's put a quick date range on the photo. HSBC's headquarters here are an obvious clue. The building was completed in 1935, so the photo can't be any older than that. Next, if we look up and to the right, you see here, this is the Governor's residence, Government House, with its ballroom next to it. Now, during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, these were demolished and replaced with the building that you see today. So this picture must have been taken before World War II. The photo was sold as a postcard, and luckily for us, it was used. We can see that the postcard was written on the 27th of January 1940. So we can say that this is a view of Hong Kong taken sometime between 1935 and 1940. Now, what was happening along the seafront in Hong Kong just before the war? The building on the left here was caught up in the changes that were underway. It was built back in 1898 and originally known simply as Number 2 Connaught Road. But in 1939, a Japanese man, Mr. Toshihiko Ito, bought the building and renamed it the New Oriental Building. And it's been suggested that one attraction of that building was its view to the east, so looking off to the edge here. It looked out over the Royal Naval Dockyard and gave the Japanese a clear view of everything that was going on there. See the sign here for Reuters as we'd know them, I guess. The news agency who were obviously one of the tenants here, and they may well have chosen that location to be next to this building. So this was a great spot for overseas communications. It housed the Eastern Extension and Great Northern Telegraph companies. So this very much the communications hub for Hong Kong at the time. Moving along, this is the second generation of Hong Kong Club. The first one was over on Queen's Road. They moved over here. The building not quite big enough for their needs, so they also built this building in the background here. This was the Hong Kong Club Annex, and then the two were linked by a footbridge shown here. The next two should be familiar. They're the only two that still survive today. So in the foreground we've got the Cenotaph here, and then behind that we've got the Law Courts building. This area here, the land in front of HSBC, this was known, and in fact still is known, as Statue Square, and it got its name from the collection of statues that were dotted around the square. The main statue was this one in the centre here. It was a statue of Queen Victoria, one of many members of the British royal family who had their statue erected here. Most but not all were royalty. The one down the front here, for example, this shows a seated Sir Henry May, one of Hong Kong's previous governors. And over by the bank, sort of roughly over here, there was a statue of Sir Thomas Jackson from HSBC. This patch of land even became known as Royal Square for a while in the early days, but over time Statue Square seemed to take over from that, and Royal Square gradually fell out of use. The royal theme was certainly very strong though. We've got Queen's Pier here, Queen's Building here, Prince's Building just over here. So this was very much the centre of patriotic Hong Kong in the early 20th century. Queen's Building on the harbour front here means that it's a great location for shipping companies. You can see several of their signs, Torsen & Co. We've got Norddeutscher Lloyd, Hong Kong, Canton and Macau Steamboat Company, and of course Cook's. Not exactly a shipping company, but the big tourist agency, Thomas Cook, you'd call them today. Cook's would rely on shipping to move their tourists around the world. There is one exception here, the Advertising and Publicity Bureau Limited. That was run by Mrs. Betty Church, who was really a remarkable woman. I'll put a link to more information about her in the notes below. Continuing on, we come to St. George's Building here. Icehouse Street running between them, and at the end of Icehouse Street was the Star Ferries pier. That's what we can see here. Then it's back to Royalty again. This is King's Building, and the one on the end, the last one over here, this was the Union Building. So what became of all these buildings? Well, as mentioned, everything except for the Cenotaph and the Law Courts has been redeveloped, and some sites have been redeveloped more than once already in the 80-something years since this photo was taken. So these two, for example, these two are now home to a much larger single building, Chater House. There is still a St George's building at this location, though it's a newer generation. Down in front of it, the Star Ferry. Well, their pier has moved twice since this picture was taken, each time because of reclamation. So reclamation here in the 50s pushed this one out to just off Edinburgh Place, that part of Central. The new pier is still a short walk from Central, so not too great an impact. Then more recently, when it was relocated out to its current location, that really is quite a walk from Central, so it's had quite an impact, a lot less people wanting to travel by Star Ferry. There's also one of the Star Ferry ferries in the picture. Here we are, over here. We take a look, it's called the Electric Star. It was still quite new when this picture was taken, built in 1933. It was quite revolutionary at its time because instead of using the older steam engines or even a more modern diesel engine, this was powered by a diesel-electric combination. Here's a clipping about it from a 1930s book that begins, "This is one of the most important vessels afloat." So quite a glowing praise for it there. And up here we've got a diagram of how it was laid out. So you can see a big diesel motor in the centre here, and that powered a generator, and that fed electricity to two electric motors, one facing in each direction and connected to the propellers. The Electric Star was one of several Star Ferries that were sunk during the war, but after the war it was salvaged and returned to service, although its diesel electric engine was replaced with just a plain old diesel engine. So that brought the Star Ferry's first experiment with diesel electric power to an end. What other changes happened around Statue Square here? Well, Queen's Pier, like the Star Ferry Pier, that was moved out when this area was reclaimed in the 1950s. The replacement Queen's Pier stood in front of City Hall, but again reclamation meant that would lose access to the sea, and it was demolished in 2008. These two buildings were redeveloped in the 1960s. In the foreground, this is now the site of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, while at the back here, this is still a Prince's building, although it's obviously a much newer building. At the back of the square, HSBC also underwent a redevelopment a little bit later in the 1980s, and that gives us their current headquarters building on the site today. The big changes in Statue Square were really happening down here though, among the statues. Let me switch over to a newspaper. So this is a commemorative issue of the Hong Kong News. That was the only English language newspaper in Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. You can see it was printed on December the 25th, 1942. It was celebrating the first anniversary of the Japanese victory. And the front page here was filled up with the governor's proclamation. So this had been made by the new Japanese governor back at the start of the year. You can see it's dated around February. And this should be recognisable. So to leave everyone in no doubt who was the new boss in town, they put a copy of his speech into this, which was the old shelter where Queen Victoria's statue had once stood. So this is right in the centre of town, in the heart of Statue Square. The Japanese didn't only replace Queen Victoria's statue, they in fact took away all the statues from Statue Square, and they were shipped back to Japan with the idea of melting them down to be used in the Japanese war effort. So here's a photo of the square, an aerial photo taken, I would guess, in 1945, not long after the Japanese surrender. So down at the front here, this is that shelter where first of all it was home to Queen Victoria, and then it was home to the Japanese proclamation, and here it's just all been cleared out. Obviously the returning British didn't want any traces of the Japanese occupation left. We can also see some of those plinths where the statues used to stand. There's one here, and one over here. After the surrender then, as Allied forces moved into Japan, they found that two of these statues had actually survived the war. One the statue of Queen Victoria, and one the statue of HSBC's Sir Thomas Jackson. They were both shipped back to Hong Kong, but only Jackson came back to Statue Square. You can see him somewhere around about here today. Queen Victoria was never reinstated at Statue Square. Instead, she now sits over in Victoria Park, over by Causeway Bay. The photo here also shows changes to the gardens in Statue Square. On the left, you see the garden is now home to these temporary buildings. These were actually put up by the British in 1941, so nothing to do with the Japanese. And despite being called temporary buildings, they actually stood here right up until 1957. If you read the proclamation on the newspaper, you'll see it was promising a flourishing Greater East Asia. But in fact, the Japanese occupation brought great hardship and even starvation to Hong Kong's residents. And you can see one of the results of that over here. So this patch of garden has been dug up and turned into little vegetable plots. Back to the seafront, and the last three of the buildings on the seafront here. The Hong Kong Club was redeveloped in three phases. In the 1960s, the first thing to go was the footbridge, severing the link between the annex and the main building, and shortly after that the annex was demolished and redeveloped as a commercial building. The main club building here, that carried on until the 1980s, when it too was demolished and replaced with the modern club building on the site today. Now this site here, the Telegraph Company's site, this one has been a busy one. In fact, I'd say it's a poster child for the pace of redevelopment in Hong Kong. If you go back to the earliest days of British Hong Kong, this whole area here was just part of the harbour. Then in the 1890s, this piece of land was reclaimed as part of the large Chater reclamation. As we mentioned before, this went up in 1898 and is the longest lived of the buildings on the site, at least so far. It survived until just after the war. It was the first of the buildings to be redeveloped after the war in 1948. The building that replaced it is this one. So it was built as a lecture house. You can still see it's carrying on the communications theme, although with wireless and telegrams. You can see the sign for telegrams replacing the telegraph. It's definitely moving ahead with the newer technologies. It had a name change. It became Mercury House later on, but survived then until it was replaced by the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 1993. That wasn't around for very long and is in turn replaced by the China Construction Bank's building in 2012. So 4 buildings in less than 130 years. I do wonder if this gets the award for the most redeveloped site in Hong Kong. Back to our last building, one on the left here, which is only on its third building since the land was reclaimed. So after this came the Farama Hotel, and then currently it's the AIA building on the site here. Now we'll move on at a faster pace for the rest of the picture, and we'll take a quick look at mid-levels next. And there are 2 buildings I want to concentrate on, one over here and one over here. So either end of the picture, they've got something in common. You can see this one's a lot smaller than the others, or at least appears smaller, so it's some way back in the distance. This is over on Lower Albert Road. Built over 100 years ago, 1919, originally built as the St. Paul's College Hostel and later renamed the Church Guest House. And one of its claims to fame is that the famous writer Han Su-yin lived there for a time. Now today only this eastern half of the building survives. It's called Martin House today. The western half has already been redeveloped. And it's that half-half redevelopment that's the connection with the other building that we're interested in. So let's swing across to the east, past the Bank of East Asia, past the Government House, past the Kennedy Terrace here, and we cross over the Peak Tram line that was running down behind the bank. Past a couple of famous schools. We've got the St. Paul's Co-ed here, St. Joseph's over here. We keep going, keep going, keep going until we come to this one. So it stood above McDonnell Road, that's running along here. You reached it up a driveway running up here, and it was known as Simla House. Simla was the summertime capital of British India, so it was a well-known name when this photo was taken. And like the church guest house, this was also redeveloped in halves, and again it was the western half that was redeveloped first. So this side was knocked down, and they built a new building called St. John's Court on the site. Not the St. John's Court you see there today, we're talking about the previous generation. And the reason that we're interested in it is because that previous generation was completed in 1939. But there's no sign of any demolition here, let alone construction work for the new building. So if we allow at least a year for that to take place, then that dates the photo to 1937 or earlier. And that shrinks the range of possible dates for the photo to between 1935 and 1937. Here's a good landmark to get our bearings in this section. So this is the highest of the road bridges across the Peak Tram. This is the bridge at May Road. If we follow it west, we pass Mr. Bruin's house here. We saw this in the 1909 panorama. And then we come around to a cluster of buildings, and this group here, which all are very similar style, was a good landmark to look out for. It's the royal theme again. They were known as the Queen's Buildings. Queen's Buildings here. Today the Glen Ely ESF School stands on the site of the westernmost. So roughly about here, and this is Hornsey Road coming along. Back to the east, over the Peak Tram, and then around this section there are a couple of roads running along the hillside. We've got one heading uphill. This is the Magazine Gap Road heading up to the Gap, and a little bit further down there's a road which is much flatter, and that's Bowen Road. And I think this building, as far as I can work out, is number 6 and 7 Bowen Road. But we've got mixed messages about this one on Grullo, and also a note I see that it was known as the Morning Post Flats at some point. So if you can add any memories or photos of this building, especially anything from around the 1930s when this photo was taken, please do get in touch. Finally, we're up to the peak, and I'm going to start with the Peak Tram again. And we can see this is the line of the tram running up the hill. And I think we've caught a tram here. That's probably this little faint patch, either pulling into or departing from the station here. This is the Barker Road station. We can see the big columns for that here. So Barker Road, one of the big roads running along this section of the peak. Now, if you're interested in any of the buildings that you see here, unlike the lower down sections, this part of the island, the buildings are quite sparse. So it's quite easy to track where they are on the maps. So if you come to Grullo and you visit the map of all places, it's quite easy to find the buildings that you're looking for. So it runs right across until we end up with this group of big buildings over here. And these were known as the Victoria Hospital. Now this time round, it's the eastern section that's been redeveloped. So this is no longer with us. And the western section, that still survives. So this originally built as the hospital's maternity wing, and then later converted into Victoria Flats. Now one other building that we passed along Barker Road, and it caught my eye, is this one here. This is Altadena. and the reason it caught my eye is because I've written about it. Here we are. It appears in the first of my books, where we go to see what's left of the building today and also recall some of its stories from the 1930s and 1940s. Well, that wraps up our investigations today of the view of Hong Kong, taken as we worked out sometime between 1935 and 1937. If you'd like to know what happens next, I've got another video on YouTube, How World War II Changed Hong Kong, and that makes a good sequel to this one. For more photos and stories, there's also my series of 5 books available, with Volume 1 now available in Chinese too. And finally, if you'd like to hear some of these stories in person, I'm giving talks in Glasgow on the 1st of November and Exeter on the 8th of November, where I'll be showing photos and telling stories from my first book. Now, if you'd like more information about any of these, or you've got any information you can add to this video, then please get in touch through the comments below. And that finishes today's video. Thank you very much for watching.